Scripture reading this afternoon comes from the book of Matthew. We'll be reading from the 4th chapter, verses 18 through 22. And Jesus, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him.
Thank you, brother, so much. And it's so good to come back together and worship together. Such a blessing to have this day, and so encouraged by the ladies and their lunch and learn, and the men and bros and barbecue. So grateful for the blessing of the church and the enrichment that is experienced when we come together, when we stir one another up unto love and good works, when we get to see each other's faces, we get to embrace each other. And I think about so often the words of Peter in John chapter 6, when so many have left Jesus and they turn away. And Jesus asks then the question, do you also want to go away? Verse 67. And you think about how many other things that we could be doing right now. You think about how many different ways we could be experiencing the first day of the week. You think about our friends and our neighbors, our coworkers, and what they usually do on a day like today. It's beautiful outside. I'm sure that folks go on walks. I'm sure they go play golf. They probably go on the lake. They sleep in. They just relax, they grill out. There's so many different things that can be done. But yet, just as Peter responded here in verse 68, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And what we get to take part in on this first day of the week is worshiping the one who makes the lake possible. Worshiping the one who developed mankind with such intellect, with such a mind, with such a skill to be able to build something as a boat. The one who made the beauty of creation, the beauty of the trees, the beauty of the weather, the beauty of the flowers, who made food possible and to be able to grill it and cook it out. The one who did all of those things. We get to worship him. We get to come together and stir one another up in our praise and worship to him. What a blessing that is. We're looking at this afternoon, continuing on in our study of his life, looking at now his young life or his early ministry, his early life. We spent some time this morning looking at Luke chapter 2 as it relates to the boy Jesus, the young Christ, and looking at what at 12 years old he was doing, and took some notes from that chapter in view of his overall life. He was about his father's business at an early age. That was cultivated because of Mary and Joseph and the way in which he was brought up. But now we're looking at his young life or his young ministry, his early ministry, as he is now finding and identifying disciples, those that will follow him. And we're going to look at Jesus as it relates to his instruction here to follow me, and also think about more specifically our application of following Jesus. The life of Jesus gives mankind access to become a disciple of God. And I want you to think about being a disciple for just a second. I want you to think about what it means to follow someone, what it means to be under the supervision, under the guidance, under the influence of someone. I want you to imagine how you would respond differently depending upon who it was that told you to follow them. If someone who is a thief, who goes and steals maybe expensive artwork or goes and robs banks, someone who hacks into various computer systems and accesses all kinds of resources, if they told you to follow them, how would you respond? How would you react? What would you think about? Take someone who's a murderer. Murdering doesn't take place just on impulse. Murder doesn't just take place in cases where there was a context that brought about some kind of physical altercation and murder just was the outcome. There are those who murder in that they premeditate it, they plan it, They plot it, they get paid for it. What if someone like that came and said, hey, I want you to come follow me. I want you to come learn about me, learn about my craft, be a disciple of mine. What about a corrupt leader? What about someone like Putin or someone like Kim Jong-un? What about these leaders who declare that, in some cases even, murder be carried out upon entire pockets of population within their citizenry? President Xi, for example, or other dictators such as those in Venezuela or other regions within Latin America or Africa. What if they said, hey, come learn of what I do, come follow me? How would we respond to these folks? We wouldn't want anything to do with them. How would we respond, however, to others? Flip the coin for a second. What about Mr. Rogers? What if you had an opportunity to have followed Mr. Rogers as it relates to just his demeanor, the way in which he attacks problems and challenges across society? It'd be pretty interesting, wouldn't it? What about somebody like George Washington? What if George Washington would have come up to you and said, hey, follow me, come learn about how I make judgments and how I make decisions, how I lead? What about someone like Helen Keller? Wouldn't that have been fascinating? I don't think we'd ever say that we have an excuse not to do something if we would have had an opportunity to have followed Helen Keller. God has offered us the opportunity to follow him. The life of Jesus, his very life, is an invitation. The fact that he came to this earth, he has provided mankind an invitation and has stated such to follow him. You think about what is stated as Matthew records in Matthew chapter 11. Starting there in verse 28, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus has offered us to follow him. Now, you got offered by George Washington to follow him. Would you have felt pretty honored? Would you have felt privileged? Helen Keller, Mr. Rogers, what a gift. What an opportunity. However, the creator of all the universe has extended the invitation that we follow him. Folks, there is no access. There is no rank. There is no position. There is no better institution or circumstance or context in all of creation than to be able to sit at the feet of Jesus and learn from him. And that's what he's offered. Now, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas as to what it means to follow Jesus. Some people think that means just wearing a cross around your neck, or putting a cross maybe on their arm via a tattoo, or maybe putting a bumper sticker with the cross, or a fish or something on the back of their car. That's the extent. If you do that, hey, you've checked the box. That's all you need to do to follow Jesus. Other people have an idea that, hey, if you own a Bible, that's following Jesus. Or if you recognize God somewhere, as we talked about earlier a few weeks ago, I think it's somewhere mid-March to mid-April, somewhere in that range. If you follow God in that particular day where there's Easter eggs and peeps, then, and also do it in December, then you follow Jesus. But what does it really mean to follow Jesus? What does the Bible teach us of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus? By the way, think also about George Washington, Helen Keller, Mr. Rogers, those kinds of situations. If we had access to follow them in our minds, what would that entail? If they came and said, hey, I want you to benefit from who I am, and I'm going to grant you access to be my disciple and to follow me, what would that entail? That wouldn't just entail a bumper sticker. That wouldn't just entail a necklace or a tattoo or some kind of decoration or theme, buzzwords. That would entail a lot more, and we understand that. So what does the Bible teach us about following Jesus? First off, following Jesus requires friendship. requires friendship. Jesus is our trusted friend. We can trust Jesus. We can become a friend of Jesus. You think about what James says regarding Abraham, James chapter 2 and verse 23, and the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Abraham got to enter into a bond with God in following after him and being his disciple to the point where he was considered a friend of God. There is a level of trust. By the way, James, in giving us details regarding trust, we can trust God, folks, and it is a blessing that we can trust God. You think about what James tells us in James chapter 1, starting there in verse 12. He said, Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Now, this is important as we think about discipleship, as we think about following, and as we think about trust. There's all kinds of stories in pop culture, all kinds of stories in various books and various cultures that give this idea of absolute devotion to points and situations that are quite despicable. I'll just give you one example. There's a lot, but I'll give you one example. Someone who wants to be a devoted servant to the U.S. government. Again, this is pop culture reference. And being that devoted servant to the U.S. government to the level of being a spy, engaging in espionage, will have to engage in certain practices and do certain things that, although despicable, is for the betterment of the government, and so therefore it's warranted and therefore must be done. And they will actually phrase this and call this something to the effect of being a sin eater. In other words, you take on a certain role, you actually engage in something that is quite disgusting and despicable, but you do it because the ends justify the means. And so therefore, it is worthwhile. And oftentimes, in these types of contexts, folks get tripped up because they can't imagine from a morality perspective how they could do such things. And so sometimes those kinds of ideas come into play as it relates to our relationship with God. God would, in some cases, put before us things that are damaging. Put before us things that would cause us to trip up or to sin, and that he actually is engaged in that process. But what James tells us is, no, verse 17, God is the giver of everything that is good. He is the source of perfection. He is the source of that which we can always trust. He's not the one that brings about pain, the temptation, the veering off course that comes about because of sin. That's not God's fault. We can trust God. He wants to be our friend. And we know this because we find in John chapter 15, for example, and in verse 15, Jesus says there, John chapter 15 and verse 14. Verse 15 and 15, John 15, 15. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I heard from my Father, I have made known to you. So again, this is an integrated, this discipleship, us following Jesus, is intimate. He shares with us what he knows, and we obviously trust him and come to him and befriend him, knowing that he has our best interests in heart. Now reference verses 13 and 14. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. Let's go on to point number 2. Point number 1, friendship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Friendship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Point number 2, the world doesn't like this, obedience. Notice there in verse 14, you are my friends if, it's conditional. Conditional, if you do whatever I commands you. Let's go back over to James chapter 4. James chapter 4, and notice here in verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Can't be both. Can't follow the world and be a friend of the world and at the same time follow and be a friend of God. One or the other. We have to make a choice. We also find in Luke chapter 6, notice with me beginning there in verse 46, Luke chapter 6 and verse 46, Jesus says, "But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like." Verses 48 through 49, he then gives us the account of the foolish man and the wise man. What is the wise man doing? Well, the wise man, he is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. The one that makes Jesus his friend by doing what Jesus says is the one who has built his faith, built his house on the rock. But notice verse 49, "But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." This is, of course, correlating to Matthew chapter 7, the foolish man and the wise man. And the foolish man built his house not on the rock, but the foolish man builds his house instead without a foundation, builds it on the sand, and guess what? It falls. Obedience is required as it relates to following Jesus. Notice also Hebrews chapter 5, and notice there in verse 8, Hebrews 5 and verse 8, the Hebrews writer writes there, "Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered." Now remember, we are his friend. He is our master. We are his servants, but yet he calls us friends. But at the same time, what he endured, we likewise should expect to endure ourselves. And so, what did he have to endure? He had to endure obedience. To the point of what? To the point of death. Notice verse 9. "And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him." Jesus is my friend. Jesus is the author of my eternal salvation if I'm living my life obeying him. I cannot follow Jesus. I cannot have a relationship with Jesus. I cannot be a disciple of Jesus unless I'm obeying Jesus. John says it this way, 2 John verse 9, "Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son." Following Jesus involves friendship, involves obedience, involves, point number 3, learning. Learning at the feet of Jesus. We read Matthew 11, 28 through 31 just a few minutes ago. "Take my yoke upon you." In other words, we are going to be in sync with Jesus. We are living our life tied to, connected to Jesus. Paul says this in Colossians chapter 1 and in verse 24 regarding the devotion that he had for living for Christ. He says, "I now rejoice in my sufferings," Colossians 1 verse 24, "for you, and fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ for the sake of his body, which is the church." To learn of Jesus, what does that entail? What does it mean to learn of Jesus? It means to live our life for the will of God to the point that by doing so, we then suffer the consequences in the process of it. Just as Jesus did. Paul says, "I still have yet more to do as it relates to filling up in my body afflictions for the cause of Christ." I haven't yet learned in totality what it means to live for Jesus. Does that mean he's not obedient to Jesus? Does that mean he's not following Jesus? No, he is. But he also recognizes there's a gap. In other words, I have a lot more to go in terms of learning what it means of what my master went through, of what my Lord endured. You think about what Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and in verse 12 regarding those who are going to live for Jesus. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, Paul says, "Yes, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution." I want you to go with me as well to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4 And I want you to think about this idea of learning for just a second. First of all, what is learning? Let's start there. Learning is not necessarily new information. Learning may be reorienting information already captured, but because of circumstances, we then shift it around. We have different associations that we then begin to tie into and begin to create. Oftentimes, new information provokes learning. Why? Because that new information penetrates our mind, and then the information already stored is reoriented. But sometimes that information that's already there may just be reoriented because of our context. And the church is a blessing whereby we can constantly root our minds, root our hearts, deeply intertwined via the gospel with our brethren closer to God based upon the context of our life. Notice what Paul writes, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 17. This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling, have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But you have not so learned Christ. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off, concerning your former conduct, the old man, which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. I want you to go to verse 15 now, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. But speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. What does that mean? That means as I live my life in the truth, speaking the truth, striving toward the truth, closer and closer every single day, as I'm putting off the old man and putting on the new man with the gospel, as I am linked into the relationships that I have via the blood and bond of Jesus Christ with my brethren, I am constantly growing up and developing as a Christian, learning what it means to live, to follow Jesus. To live for and follow Jesus. Following Jesus involves learning, but it also involves loyalty. Loyalty. Notice what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10. Verse 16, we understand that this is in the context of Jesus sending out the 12. You notice all the way back up at the beginning of the chapter. But verse 16 specifically, he says, Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But then notice what he says in verse 32. He says, Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Oftentimes we use this, even the Pew Packers did a few minutes ago, as it relates to what God teaches us for salvation. Certainly confession is a part of what God teaches us regarding salvation. Romans 10 verse 10, Acts 8, 34 through 39. But in this context, what Jesus is actually saying is, hey, as you go out as sheep before wolves, as you go out, because you are being sent to further the gospel, you need to remember that under threats, you are to confess me. Do not deny me. Do not protect your own physical existence in exchange for denying me, or else I will deny you. So what loyalty does Jesus expect? We are to obey. We're to follow him. We're to befriend him, but at what cost? Well, Luke chapter 14 and verse 26 tells us the extent of discipleship. That our discipleship is to the extent, Luke chapter 14 and verse 26, that we are to be willing to give up all meaningful relationships, all of what we value on this earth, in this life, if it is in the way of our loyalty to Christ. Likewise, the cost and the extent that we are to go in regards to our faithfulness is we are willing to die if it means living requires us to be unfaithful. Be faithful until death. Revelation 2 and verse 10. That means be faithful to the point of dying. That's the loyalty that Jesus expects. And so following Jesus, you might notice already we're doing an acrostic. Friendship, obedience, learning, loyalty. Y'all are going to love this next O. The younger people will. OG. The OG. What does that mean? I'm speaking slang, folks. The cool term that means just original. Okay? Original. Following Jesus means following, notice, Jesus. Following Jesus. Not following Chick-fil-A. Not following Joel Osteen. Not following TBN or the Hallmark Channel. Means following Jesus. And sometimes people will say they're following Jesus and they'll claim that what they're doing is following Jesus, but don't blame that on Jesus. How do we follow Jesus? Paul says, imitate me even as I imitate Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1. Likewise, Peter tells us as it relates to speaking, as it relates to what it is that we uphold, we are to speak as the oracles of God. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 11. Following Jesus means that we can root everything back. We can explain our actions. We can justify why we're doing what we're doing because it all roots to the OG. It roots to the original, to Jesus. Everything I'm doing is based upon Jesus. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17. And whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name, according to the authority of Jesus Christ. Following Jesus, following the original Jesus, his authority. And finally, worship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? It means to worship. The routine of Jesus was to be with God's people and worship. We studied that this morning, Luke chapter 2. You also notice later on in Luke's account, Luke chapter 2, we see the young boy Jesus worshiping God, being trained and brought up, being developed in his life to worship God based upon the influence and guidance of his family. But notice also in Luke chapter 4, Jesus here, we find that it was his routine, it was his custom to be in the presence of God's people and to worship God. Notice verse 16 of Luke chapter 4. So Jesus worshiped. Jesus was in the presence of God's people, was engaged in that practice with God's people. So if we don't decide to follow Jesus by our worship, how can we explain other areas of our life? In other words, if we are making the decision to be in the presence of God and his people to worship, then what is that an indicator regarding us following Jesus in all other aspects of life? Think about it. Number one, worship is visible to all of our brethren. Do not forsake the assembling of ourselves, Hebrews chapter 10. So, if when we know we are in the presence of all of our brethren and we are choosing not to be there, that's an instance where we can physically show up and actually be present and we're choosing not to follow Jesus. What does that say about the rest of our life? Think about this as well. Worship attendance is an outward action that is able to be identified. Jesus tells us we are to judge according to the fruits of another. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 20. These are opportunities to actually bear fruit according to the Word of God. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17. Worship is an approach outcome that indicates whether we are approaching God in our lives or not. Think about that. Worship is an environment and a context whereby we approach God. what does it say about the rest of our life if we are not following Jesus as it relates to worship and being present with God's people? Think about what James says in James chapter 4 and verse 7 beginning. He says, "Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." What better opportunity do we have to do that than worship? What a blessing it is to be able to come together and worship God and be with each other as we assemble based upon the way in which the eldership here at Cumming has prescribed for us concerning Bible class, concerning our worship services together. And here's the question: are we following Jesus or not? Are we following Jesus or not in our lives? He wants us to follow Him. What a privilege to be able to do so. Maybe you're here this afternoon, you're not yet a child of God. Won't you make the decision to become one by putting on Christ via baptism, as we read about in Galatians chapter 3, 26 to 27. At that point, when we are baptized, we then put on Christ and become a child of God, as we see exemplified in Acts 8, 34 through 39. Brother or sister, if you have fallen away, if you're no longer following Jesus and you're ready to make it right, you're ready to come home before it's everlasting too late, we're here to assist you in any way that we can. Won't you come forward as all together we stand?
Rock of ages.